By 1900, an empire that had once made Europe tremble had a problem. Its own taxes were no longer collected by its own people. A foreign-run organization, staffed by thousands of employees, answerable to bondholders in London, Paris, and Berlin, controlled huge parts of the Ottoman economy. This organization employed more people than the Ottoman government's own finance ministry. How does the empire that once besieged Vienna end up handing its own tax system to foreign creditors? This is the story of the Ottoman debt crisis, one of the clearest examples in history of how borrowed money can become a tool of conquest without a single shot being fired. At its height, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents. It controlled trade routes between Europe and Asia, and its treasury was the envy of the world. But by the late 17th century, the world was changing. New sea routes around Africa let European powers bypass Ottoman-controlled trade entirely. Silver and gold from the Americas flooded into Europe, fueling economies that the Ottoman state had no direct access to. Slowly, the balance of economic power shifted. Industrial revolution transformed Western Europe. The Ottoman economy, still largely agricultural, fell behind. By the 19th century, the empire that had once been Europe's greatest threat was being called by its rivals, the sick man of Europe. In 1853, the Crimean War broke out. The Ottomans, fighting alongside Britain and France against Russia, needed money fast. In 1854, for the first time in its history, the Ottoman state borrowed money from foreign banks. It seemed like a reasonable solution to a temporary problem. It was not temporary, and it was not the last loan. Over the next 2 decades, the Ottoman government borrowed again, and again, and again. By the 1870s, the empire had taken out more than a dozen major foreign loans. Where did the money go? Some funded the military. Some funded lavish palaces and modernization projects in Istanbul. Very little went into anything that could generate future income. And the terms were brutal. Many of these loans were issued at steep discounts. The Ottomans might receive only 50 or 60% of a loan's face value in cash, while owing the full amount plus high interest. Each new loan was used partly to pay the interest on the previous ones. The debt was no longer financing the state, the debt was financing itself. Meanwhile, ordinary Ottoman subjects were taxed more and more heavily just to keep the payments flowing. By 1875, the inevitable happened. The Ottoman government announced it could no longer make full payments on its debts. Interest payments were cut in half. The following year, they were suspended entirely. Across Europe, thousands of private investors, ordinary people who had bought Ottoman bonds believing them safe, suddenly held worthless paper. This became a major diplomatic problem. The years that followed were chaotic, political upheaval at home. War with Russia in 1877 and 1878. A war the empire could barely afford and ultimately lost significant territory from. The empire that emerged was smaller, weaker, and still deeply in debt, to creditors who were running out of patience. European governments began pressuring the Ottoman state directly. The bondholders wanted guarantees, and in 1881 they got something far more powerful than a guarantee. The Sultan signed a decree creating a new institution, one that would change the relationship between the Ottoman state and its own economy forever. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration, an organization run not by the Ottoman government, but by a council of representatives from the creditor nations, Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Italy, and the Netherlands. This council was given direct control over some of the most valuable revenue sources in the empire: the salt monopoly, the tobacco monopoly, taxes on alcohol, silk, stamps, and fishing, even tribute payments from Bulgaria and surplus revenues from Cyprus and eastern Rumelia. All of it now flowed first to European bondholders, and only afterward, if anything remained, to the Ottoman treasury. The administration grew enormous. At its peak, it employed around 9,000 people, more than the Ottoman finance ministry itself. Tax collectors working for this foreign-controlled body fanned out across the empire, collecting revenue with a level of efficiency the Ottoman state itself had never achieved. For ordinary Ottoman subjects, the message was uncomfortable. Taxes that once went to their own sultan now went, by the most direct route possible, into the pockets of foreign investors. And there was another layer to this. Under agreements known as the capitulations, foreign nationals and many non-Muslim subjects living under foreign protection were largely shielded from these obligations. The burden of the debt fell disproportionately on the empire's own population, while foreign businesses operated with significant immunity from local taxation and law. The debt administration was not purely extractive, though. It also became a major financier of infrastructure, funding railways and modernization projects across the empire, often built by European companies. But these projects mostly served European strategic and commercial interests, connecting resource-rich regions to ports for export to Europe. By the early 20th century, debt service consumed a staggering share of total state revenue. Some estimates suggest the Ottoman government was spending well over half of its income just to service old loans. There was little left for the things a modern state needed: education, military modernization, infrastructure the government itself controlled. A new generation of Ottoman reformers came to see foreign financial control as a national humiliation, one of many grievances that fueled growing nationalist movements in the empire's final decades. Then came the First World War. The Ottoman Empire entered the conflict already financially exhausted and emerged from it completely destroyed. By 1922, the empire that had once stretched across 3 continents no longer existed. A new state rose from its ashes, the Republic of Turkey. But the old debts did not simply disappear. At the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, the Ottoman debt was divided among the successor states that had emerged from the empire's former territories, Turkey, and the new nations of the Balkans and the Middle East. Astonishingly, Turkey continued making payments on this debt for decades. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration's office in Paris was not finally wound down until the late 1940s. A debt taken on to fight a war in 1854 was still being settled nearly a century later, outliving the empire that created it and the war it was meant to pay for. This story might sound distant, but the basic pattern has repeated many times since. A country borrows heavily, often for short-term needs rather than productive investment. Debt service consumes a growing share of revenue. Eventually, foreign creditors, whether private bondholders or international institutions, gain direct influence over domestic economic policy. Economists today call these arrangements conditionality, loans that come attached to control over tax policy, spending, or specific revenue streams. The mechanism has changed. The underlying dynamic has not. Sovereignty, it turns out, is not only lost on battlefields. Sometimes it is signed away, one loan agreement at a time, until a government finds it no longer controls its own income. The Ottoman Empire did not fall only because of lost battles or shifting borders. Long before its final collapse, it had already lost control of its own treasury. And once that control was gone, every other kind of power, military, political, diplomatic, became harder and harder to hold on to. A piece of paper, signed in 1854 to pay for a war, and the chain of consequences it set off, outlasted the empire, the war, and almost everyone who signed it. History rarely announces its turning points clearly. Often, they look at the time like ordinary financial decisions, a loan here, a guarantee there. The consequences only become visible decades later. If you made it this far, leave a comment. Do you see any modern parallels to the Ottoman debt crisis? Which countries today remind you of this story? In the next video, we look at the fall of the Spanish Empire and how a flood of New World silver triggered one of the worst inflation crises in European history. See you there.